Hello and welcome to this short video where I'm just going to discuss the minor assignment reading Soyinka across cultures and the major assignment that I gave you, the multimodal adaptation, where you're going to take a text from another culture and adapt it so that you can speak to your own society and your own culture through that text. First, with reading Soyinka across cultures, I wanted to address some of the things that came up in the discussion forum. In particular, the question of Pilkings and Olunde. Pilking, I asked if you think he's a sympathetic character, and overwhelmingly people said that he wasn't. I think that this is a correct interpretation. He is a sort of xenophobic character. He has an intrinsic sense of the superiority of his own culture and the assumptions he makes about the world. But one of the reasons that I think he might be a more sympathetic character is precisely because he represents a way of reading other cultures that we may ourselves be guilty of in certain circumstances. So in this course we're talking about, and in this unit we're talking about reading across cultures, the idea of encountering cultures that are different from our own and learning not to rush to judgment about what they are, and learning to appreciate the damage that those kind of assumptions can do. And we find that, I think on a first reading of Soyinka's play, we're likely to, with our first encounter of Ellison and the ritual, to find it very strange and maybe to find it very distasteful that somebody will commit ritual suicide in this way. And so we actually go through a process of understanding, or it asks us to go through a process of understanding at least, where we move from that position of revulsion to a position of relative understanding, even if we don't necessarily sympathize with the culture that we're reading. Pilking is on the other side of that divide insofar as he doesn't have that ability to think outside of, first of all, outside of the institution of British imperialism that has given him his career and that has probably shaped his entire life, and his sort of inability to sort of think beyond the assumptions of his own childhood and perhaps the assumptions of his own cultural superiority. But his position is one that in many ways we all participate in and to some extent are all kind of guilty of. And when I ask if he's a sympathetic character, it's not that I think he's a particularly good guy, but rather that it may be that he reflects the position of many Western readers, and that Soyinka is in a sense presenting him as a possible model of what's wrong with, let's say, a Eurocentric reading of this text and by extension of Yoruba culture. On the other hand, Olunde is kind of the opposite sort of character. Many of you pointed out that he reveals himself to still be very much immersed in Yoruba culture when he returns. Pilking expects Olunde to have become more civilized, that he will have adopted English culture and become more sympathetic to the assumptions that Pilking himself has, and he's disappointed in this. But what makes Olunde an interesting figure is that he transcends both cultures, that he sort of is neither one thing nor the other. He doesn't ultimately prove himself to be Yoruba first and British second, but rather his exposure to British culture and British education has allowed him to effectively navigate that world and also to critique that world. So whereas Pilking sees Yoruba culture as uncivilized and barbaric, Olunde is able to notice that many of the practices that define British culture, its imperialism, especially its investment in war, and the huge physical, psychological, and emotional damage that war does, and especially that modern warfare does, renders that attitude that we as Europeans are more civilized and more advanced. It renders it very hypocritical, because Olunde is able to see through that rhetoric and able to see a kind of brutish and brutal reality behind that. And that's what makes Olunde a kind of threatening figure. And it makes him a very interesting figure to focus on when we're reading across cultures, because these kind of in-between figures are always, on the one hand, signs of the possibility that we shouldn't think in binary terms of self and other, that somebody who is other than me is irreversibly and irreducibly different, but rather that there are sort of commonalities, human commonalities. But more importantly, a figure like Olunde is threatening, because we tend to think about the world in terms of self and other. We tend to think in terms of black and white, American versus Mexican, man versus woman. And it's a very easy way of thinking about the world when we think in those sort of binary terms. We can reduce everything to very simplistic categories, and you either belong or you don't. You're either with me or against me. And so creating those sort of divisions makes the world easier to understand, and it fosters things like xenophobia and racism and so on, but it has a kind of allure. And Olunde is a threatening figure to that, precisely because he's able to occupy that in-between space. One of the things you're going to be doing in the Reading Soyinka Across Cultures essay is thinking about its comparison with Sophocles and Oedipus the King, which I'm looking forward to seeing how you think these two plays work off of one another, how Soyinka responds to it. What I want to focus on is not just how he, copies certain elements of Greek theatre, but rather how you can see him departing from it, how he works off of that basis in order to speak back to a culture very different from his own. So that a play that incorporates elements of Yoruba culture, but also elements of European or Western culture, is able to similarly occupy this in-between space where it's able to interrogate both European culture and Yoruba culture. And so, like Olunde himself, this is a kind of play that is in between cultures rather than a representation of Yoruba culture necessarily, that it is itself a kind of hybrid, sort of hybrid piece of literature, and in being hybrid is in many ways a kind of dangerous thing, that it's a sort of something to be resisted. So when you are comparing Soyinka to Sophocles, I did want to emphasize that catharsis is something that a few people address, but in some cases we're not necessarily addressing it correctly. Catharsis simply refers to a release of pent-up emotion, and it refers to an action on the part of the audience traditionally. So catharsis would refer to when emotion has been pent up by the play, that there is a moment in which that emotion is released. It doesn't refer to any characteristic of a character or any achievement as such. So it's not necessarily that that Oedipus achieves catharsis or that he needs to demonstrate any kind of bravery to do so. Catharsis occurs in tragedy, at moments of tragic outpouring of emotion. So it can be the culmination of a tragic series of events rather than necessarily a moment of achieving a goal or of deserving something. So it's not necessarily a moment of resolution or a moment of happiness or a moment of closure, which I think some of the readings in the discussion forum seem to imply that that catharsis means closure or a moment of happiness or release. It absolutely is not. It can also be a release of tragic emotion, and I think if you're interpreting Oedipus the King as not being a cathartic play, then you may need to revise your definition of catharsis. The other thing that a lot of people talked about was the chorus, and what sort of role the chorus plays in Sophocles and how it might be different to the role played in Soyinka. I think people were on firmer ground with that. I would say the chorus is a representation of the public voice. So in Greek theater, these are public figures, and as public figures, they are their actions have public consequences, and it's for that reason that theater is, first of all, very much um, a public event. It is not like reading a novel, which is private and psychological. The audience is very much a participant in what's happening, and we're being asked by a playwright like Sophocles to think about the action in it and what it has to say to public life and to political life. So the action in it is not necessarily personal, but also political. And so the chorus is, on the one hand, a representation of public reaction to the action that they see of these public figures, these kings and so on the stage. But they are also, in a sense, intervening in that action. They're capable of influencing things. And I'm particularly interested in how Soyinka then adopts the idea of the chorus through the women. So the women are not literally like a Greek chorus. They are individuated in some cases, although they also speak collectively. But the important thing is that on the one hand, they can narrate the action at times, and they can often clarify what's going on for us as readers or as viewers. But they are also very influential on the action, just as in public life. The actions of public figures is not independent of the attitude of a wider public. So we need to look at how figures like Iologia, but more broadly, let's say, for example, the girls who make fun of the what in Ireland we would call a West Briton, the figure of Joseph, who's a sort of who works for the British administration but is from the local area, and think about how they represent not just public opinion but also public intervention in the actions of these sort of public figures. The other thing that I would mention about reading across cultures, the minor assignment, is that one element of the rubric is critical engagement with secondary sources. I've noticed that when I ask people to draw on secondary sources, sometimes it becomes a little bit of an afterthought. There are times where a Damrosch quote is kind of thrown in to these assignments, a little bit sort of ad hoc. It's not necessarily being done with any real thought about, well, how does Damrosch help us read this play, right? So I want to make sure that you recognize that the secondary sources part of the rubric is equally important as the primary sources. So it's not that you have to spend as much time talking about Damrosch as, or you can also talk about Ojeide, the essay on teaching Soyinka to American students. Although the rubric just says Damrosch, but if you want to use Ojeide instead, you can. But I do want to note that that you don't use the secondary source as a kind of afterthought or throw in a quote for the sake of it. Draw upon what they're saying in order to help shed new light on Soyinka's play and how it reads across cultures, how it speaks back to Sophocles or speaks back to Western culture, but also, as with Atwood, how when we were looking at Margaret Atwood, I was sort of emphasizing how are they using these sources in order to speak to their own time and to their own culture. So Soyinka is not just speaking back to Western culture, he is also speaking to Yoruba culture. And it's worth remembering that we have a habit, kind of Pilking-like habit, of thinking of ourselves as the only audience for this play. And that came up in the discussion forum a little bit, I think, where people were saying, well, this is what the play is trying to do. It's trying to make us feel the inadequacy of our cultural understanding, and it's confronting us with our own ignorance. And I thought, well, in a sense, you're absolutely correct, it is. But it has multiple audiences. This is also written for Nigerian audiences. It's also written for other colonial audiences. And there isn't a single intention, I think, for this. So keep in mind when you're interpreting what this play means or how it reads across cultures, that in doing so, we still occupy our position as readers, for most of us at least, as readers from the West, or from, let's say, a Euro-American background. This leads me into the discussion of the major assignment. So this is an example of what I would call learning by doing. So up until now, we've been reading ancient texts like the Odyssey and Oedipus the King, and then reading adaptations of them, like Margaret Atwood's Penelopiad, or like Soyinka, and thinking about how these writers read across time or cultures. And we've been thinking also about what sort of problems arise when you try to adapt something from another culture to your own. So basically what we're doing in this assignment is putting those questions into practice. So we're hopefully likely to learn more about the difficulties of that type of adaptation by attempting to do it. And also we're likely to think more actively about why writers adapt things from other cultures. So again, one of the things that folks were emphasizing in the Atwood piece, in your essays, was often, well, this is how Atwood speaks back to the Odyssey and how it sort of corrects the misogyny of the Odyssey from the perspective of a modern liberal writer. However, Atwood doesn't particularly think of modern society as being especially liberal or as having especially achieved very much in terms of the liberation of women. So really what she's doing is not so much speaking to dead people from thousands of years ago. She's speaking to the present, and she's using the Odyssey to talk to our society and to offer a critique of our society, which in many ways is culturally founded on a text like the Odyssey. And similarly, I think Soyinka is drawing upon things like Sophocles in order to speak to the present and in order to speak across cultures, right? So what I want to do is to use this assignment to think actively, not just about what you're going to adapt, but why you're going to adapt it. So you can use any form you like. You can write poetry, you can write stories, art, music. In the past, people have done all sorts of things, paintings. You can use any art form in which you're comfortable and that you think is an area of your strength. The main thing on this is that there is evidence of real effort. If it feels like it's been done last minute, or that there's a general lack of effort in it, that's the main, I wouldn't say only damaging thing you can do, but in terms of your grade, that is the most important part of your grade, is that there's evidence that you invested yourself in this. The second thing is that when you're adapting a text, make sure that you're adapting something from a different culture. So don't pick something from the United States in 1985. That's not really reading across time or across cultures necessarily. Try to pick something from a culture very different to your own, and adapt it to your own culture. And in doing so, think about what sort of issues are important in your society, in your culture, and think about how the text you're adapting might help you to speak to it. So how can you, like Margaret Atwood speaking to contemporary society about the treatment of women, she adapts the Odyssey and casts it in a new light in order to make this sort of commentary. The main objective of this assignment is thinking about how you can use adaptation to read across cultures and to speak to the important conversations in our society. And that's more important than any kind of creative brilliance. The emphasis here is not on your artistic brilliance. However, if you do show artistic brilliance, that will always be rewarded. But if you don't think of yourself as a terribly creative person, that's okay too, as long as you are able to adapt a text from another culture in order to speak effectively to the types of conversations that we are having as a society. As long as you're doing all of that, it will go okay. The main thing I want to emphasize with the multimodal adaptation, though, is that I am here to help you with it if you're stuck. Feel free to contact me, especially if you're not sure if a particular text will work. And by text, I mean anything too. Like it can be a movie, a TV show, it can be art, it can be music. However, if you're not sure about what you're adapting, get in touch with me. And one of the questions that I'll ask you when you do get in touch about that will be to ask, why do you want to adapt this thing? And your initial answer could be as simple as, I just really love this thing. But I do want you to also think more deeply about, well, what do you think that this text can say to our society? How can your adaptation help you to read across cultures and to more effectively draw upon something from another culture to speak to our own, as well as speaking back to that culture? Because, as I say, this is learning by doing. It's a matter of putting into practice what we've only talked about before, and hopefully bringing home the realities of what someone like Soyinka or Atwood or whoever, Tennyson, etc., are doing when they read across time or when they read across cultures. Final thing that I wanted to mention about that is, this week I've asked you to look at a documentary called Wala Soyinka, Glutton of Tranquility. I would emphasize that you should have a look at this. It will help you to think more actively about why Soyinka writes the plays that he does and thinks about the world in the way that he does. If you decide to cite that documentary, you can use that, which talks, of course, about his life and his attitude to the world and his political engagement in Nigeria and in post-colonial politics, and how that intersects with his writing. If you decide to draw on that, you can do that instead of Damrosch as well. So you're not limited to Damrosch. I know the rubric says Damrosch, but if you decide to use the documentary or Ojaide or something like that, that's acceptable as well. And I know that a few people had talked in the discussion forum about the need for more background information to help them to understand a play like Death and the King's Horseman. I think that there's something to be said for encountering a text when you don't have much cultural background, so that you can learn through the process of reading it and be confronted with your own unexamined assumptions about the world. But the documentary does do a very good job of positioning Soyinka and his work in a broader political and cultural context, so I would highly recommend watching it. It's very entertaining as well. If you have any questions, please feel free to get in touch with me, and by email and or by phone. I'm more than happy to help out at any stage. Thanks very much for watching, and best of luck with the assignments.